Thank you for being here. I'm Georgette Knoll with the ABC League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government and influences public policy through education and advocacy. This evening, we're going to hear from Steve Simon, our Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is the state's chief election official and ensures the office meets its statutory responsibilities. The Secretary chairs the State Canvassing Board, convenes Minnesota's Electoral College, and serves on the Executive Council, Board of Investment, and Minnesota Historical Society. As keeper of the Great Seal of the state of Minnesota, the Secretary certifies the authenticity of official documents such as the acts of the legislature and proclamations and executive orders issued by the governor. The Minnesota Constitution provides that the Secretary of State is an officer in the executive department, and to qualify as Secretary of State, a person must be a qualified voter, at least 21 years old, and elected by the people. The Secretary of State is an independently elected public official. The office is currently held by Secretary Steve Simon, who was elected in 2014, and the office has a 4-year term. There are approximately 65 staff in the office, and the core functions of the office are administration of elections, registering businesses, recording of business documents and financing statements, preserving official state documents, administering an address confidentiality program. The office is also the keeper of the original chapter laws passed each legislative session and signed by the various officers of the legislature, such as the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, Chief Clerk of the House, and Secretary of the Senate, as well as Secretary of State, and in most cases, the Governor. And in addition, Mr. Simon meets with groups like League of Women Voters to talk about our favorite topics, voting and democracy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Georgette. Thank you to the ABC League. I really appreciate all who are in attendance today and those who are watching at home. I even appreciate being seated. I think that's a good thing. It's less speechy and preachy and less like an oration than it is a real discussion. I'll talk first, and then you'll talk. I really appreciate the fact that you came, and I think you ought to be able to chime in with your questions or comments or insights. First, let me start out with what I know will be a crowd-pleasing applause line. At the risk of pandering, let me tell you, I am a dues-paying member of the League of Women Voters. So I thought that would do your heart proud. I want to thank Susan Sheridan Tucker for being here, of course, the Executive Director of the Statewide League of Women Voters. She and I, or more precisely her office and my office, have collaborated already during my 9-month tenure on a number of different initiatives. Thank you to her. I want to thank Betsy O'Berry, who's really responsible for me coming here. I've known Betsy for many, many years. We've been involved in a number of projects together. She is a true public citizen. Those of you who know her know that as she did before this broadcast and before this meeting, she got up and did a public service announcement, and it was really a public service announcement, and that's what she's all about serving the public in any capacity she can. That's really in her DNA. It takes many forms, and I'm grateful to her as a friend and as someone who really is a tremendous public citizen. So Betsy, thank you very much for inviting me here. I want to give a shout out here to 2 former colleagues. One is a former legislator, one is a current legislator, but I served in the legislature, so they're both former colleagues. I want to thank former State Representative Kathy Tingelstad for being here, who represented this area very faithfully in the legislature for 10 years, is that right? 12 years. 12 years in the legislature from Kathy Tingelstad. She and I worked together on a number of projects in the legislature, including, but not limited to, being co-chairs of the bipartisan orientation session for incoming new House members. It's rigorously nonpartisan and a way to put new members through the paces. One of the most enjoyable things I did in the legislature, really before I came along. Kathy and others really made that program what it is and became, and so thank you, Kathy, for your many years of service as well. And then I want to thank current representative, but my former colleague, Jerry Newton. Where's Jerry? Is he here? Representative Newton, thank you very much. He currently serves in the legislature. We sat near each other for a couple terms on the floor. I can tell you he's one of the most thoughtful and hardworking legislators there, and he's respected on both sides of the aisle. So thank you, Representative Newton, very much for being here. So I am the new Secretary of State. I was elected, as you heard, last November for a 4-year term. I spent 10 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives representing Hopkins and St. Louis Park. That was my district. That's where I grew up. I grew up in both cities, went to Hopkins High School, class of 1988, and I live in Hopkins right now with my wife, Leah, and our 2 children, Hannah and Noah, both under 3. Both under 3, yes. So I have a full life. Let's put it that way. I'm a lawyer. I'm the first lawyer to hold this office since 1891. Not the first lawyer, but the first lawyer to hold it since 1891. I'm not quite sure why that is. It's obviously not a prerequisite for the office. But before I was in this office until January, at the same time, obviously, that I was in the legislature, I was an attorney in private practice in Minneapolis with a law firm, the Robbins Kaplan Law Firm, where I represented businesses in the business litigation department. So that's my sort of professional life while I was in the legislature and even before that time. So as you heard in the introduction, the mission of the office, the work in the office, is subdivided into several areas. We do a lot of things. Business services, for example, that's where actually the majority of people in our office serve, which is in business services. If you've ever been part of a business or around one, you know that all businesses, virtually all in Minnesota, have to register at one time or another, and most annually with the Secretary of State's office. So that's a big part of our work. We also run the Safe at Home Confidentiality Program for victims of domestic violence, those who fear for their safety, fear for their lives, the lives and safety of their family, etc. It's particularly meaningful to me. I was involved with that program before I ever thought I'd be Secretary of State as a legislator. But I think most of you are here because the brand of the office, so to speak, the brand is elections. And true to that, most people who know about our office, if they know about our office, know about it because of its elections work. And I would say that when I campaigned for this office, 98% of the comments, questions, insights, ideas, pushback from everyday voters on the campaign trail were about this issue, were about elections, not the other functions of the office. And when this office is in the news, whether it's for a statewide recount or something else, it's usually on those issues. And that's what pertains to my discussion tonight. So it's obviously a core function of our office. And my view is now and always has been that our vote is our voice. And we really better use it and urge others to use it as well because it's so very important. You know that, or you wouldn't be here tonight, and you wouldn't be members, if you are, of the League of Women Voters. So you understand that. To some extent, I'm preaching to the choir, but I want to explain a little bit to you about why I believe it and how I believe that we can all act on that belief and make it real for many more people in Minnesota. I like to say to people who aren't convinced about the merits of voting, no matter what issue you care the most about, healthcare, education, environmental protection, jobs, taxes, whatever the issue is, whatever issue you care about the most, all roads lead to the ballot box. They really do. Because it's elected officials more often than not that make decisions, either individually or collectively, about those issues that we care about. And unless we get people in office who agree with us, whatever our vantage point is, and share our views and values, we're not going to get very far on any of the issues that we care about the most. And that is the same whether you're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. So I think we all operate sort of under that premise. The question is how to get that across. This issue of elections and democracy and voting has been a passion of mine for a long, long time, since before I was Secretary of State, since before I was even in the legislature. And part of it comes from my own family's story. Now, many of us in this room, I would gather to say, or I would hazard a guess to say that most of us, and most of those who are watching this broadcast, have some sort of immigrant story to tell. So I'm not unique in that sense. Most of us do. And I have one too, and it's one that has formed me and shaped me. How could it not? Because it's part of our sort of family history. So in my case, my ancestors came from Lithuania. My great-grandparents came from Lithuania. I like to say they didn't just immigrate, they fled. Because life was, to put it mildly, not too hospitable for them in Lithuania. They couldn't worship as they pleased. They couldn't make a living often as they pleased. They didn't have basic rights, and they sure as heck did not have a right to vote. So they left. They fled. And they came to this country, and they came first to northern Minnesota, where they opened up a dry goods store on the Iron Range, catering to miners and their families. And then they eventually came to the Twin Cities. But more than just that, they finally got what they were looking for in terms of basic rights and the right to vote. They finally got a say in who governed them and how. That was something they didn't have. So this has always been something that's been precious for me. They finally got that voice, and I think it's my duty to use that voice that they at one time in their lives never had. So I was fascinated, I would say even obsessed, by elections and voting at a young age. I remember for a school project, they said we had to go volunteer somewhere. So I was 14 years old, and my mom drove me and two friends to a political campaign to do some volunteer work, and that was our volunteer experience. And so I started to merge together this idea of political campaigns with elections, with what was going on in the world, and you start to eventually have opinions on the outcomes of what's going on in the world, and that sort of led to my growing fascination, not just with voting and not just with democracy, but with public affairs generally. So my mission as Secretary of State when it comes to voting is pretty simple. I think you can fit it on a fortune cookie or a bumper sticker, something short. And my mission is I want to make it as easy as possible for all eligible Minnesotans to register and to vote. That's it. That's my mission. And as long as I live and breathe and hold this office, that's what I want to do. Now, there are many ways to approach that and many ways to deal with that. So I'm going to describe for you kind of my outlook on those issues and at least how I see my path to fulfilling that mission. Now, we're in luck, and you know this if you're a member of the League of Women Voters or if you're watching this broadcast, I suspect. We're in luck because in Minnesota, we have a good thing going. We really do. We are known far and wide and across the nation as leaders when it comes to civic participation of all kinds, not just voting. Minnesotans are doers, we are joiners, and we are voters. So we're almost always on the top of the list of turnout, and you know that. For 9 elections in a row, by one measure, we were #1 in the country. And we are almost always otherwise, if you want to use an Olympics analogy, I'm kind of an Olympics fan, we are almost always on the medal stand, so to speak. We are gold, silver, or bronze when it comes to voting nationwide in terms of turnout. But this last election in 2014, we fell off the medal stand. We were 6th. 6th in the country after 9 in a row is #1. So that's still great. A lot of states would kill to be 6th. But we weren't first, second, or third, and I'd like to get us closer to being on the medal stand, if not on the medal stand again. Can't guarantee it, but I think there are things we can do that would at least move us in that direction. So the question arises sometimes, why is Minnesota in that position? Why have we enjoyed this great civic participation? Why is it that we're almost always gold, silver, and bronze? What is it about us that is somehow special? Is it an accident? Is it a coincidence? Is it something in the water? What is it? What is it? I have a theory as to what it is. And I think primarily you can group it into 2 categories. 2 reasons why Minnesota is almost always at the top of the list when it comes to voter turnout. Reason number 1 is culture. Culture. This is my Garrison Keillor moment. I can say that Minnesota is where the women are strong, all the men are good looking, all the children are above average, and all the people vote. Virtually all of the people. So there is something about our culture in Minnesota that seems to reward civic participation of all kinds, not just voting. Something intangible, but sometimes it's truly measurable. I think it's in kind of our history, our civic history, and it's gone back not just 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but many decades. And let me give you a story or an example about a time when I think Minnesota really showed what it meant to practice democracy sort of the Minnesota way. Some of you know that we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act in this country. Lyndon Johnson signed it into law on August 6, 1965. You may know, too, that our office, and this is where the League of Women Voters statewide chapter and our office collaborated, and some of you were involved in that as well. We collaborated on 2 large-scale public events to commemorate the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And by the way, our goal all along, as we said, was not just to celebrate, not just to look in the rearview mirror and talk about what happened 50 years ago, but to celebrate, activate, motivate, and educate when it came to the Voting Rights Act and the importance of voting in general. So this was something that we've just gone through this summer. And as many of you know, President Johnson pushed for this. If you've seen the movie Selma, you know that he didn't always do so perhaps willingly or on the schedule that others wanted, but in 1965 he did push for it and it became law. And when he signed it into law on August 6, 1965, he rightly called it, in his words, a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. Interesting words, and I think prophetic words. And let's just pause for a minute to remember what life was like before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for millions of Americans around the country. I'm talking about poll taxes, literacy tests, so-called character tests, all over the country. And by the way, this wasn't just a phenomenon in the Deep South. Yes, it was mostly there, but New York State, for example, had one of the most notorious and difficult so-called literacy tests around. So it wasn't just a phenomenon in the Deep South. But the result was that you had laws on the books. And I want to emphasize that, as many of you know, I'm not talking about a subtle wink and nod sort of practice, an under-the-table collusion between people who didn't want certain other people to vote. I'm talking about laws written on the books, institutionalizing and making very explicit this kind of discrimination. And these laws had the intended effect and the actual result of shutting out millions of Americans, as we know. So it was a bad situation, and the Voting Rights Act really brought millions of Americans out of the shadow by bringing an end to their silence. I think in 1965, we as a country didn't just make a promise, we made it policy. We made it the law to give everyone a voice by giving them a vote. Now, I'm getting to the Minnesota part in a minute. Like most landmark legislation that we all can imagine, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was controversial. Hard to believe. Who could be against making it illegal to do a character test or a literacy test or a poll tax, right? But at the time, it was controversial. But Minnesota really overcame that, and it's important to realize, you know, what the odds really were there, because the debate in Congress was sometimes bitter, and in 1965, the Minnesota congressional delegation was quite politically divided. Then as now, there were 8 seats in the Minnesota House delegation. It was 4 and 4, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and they were at each other's throats on a lot of issues. Think of the time, 1965, Vietnam, the proposed Medicare and Medicaid programs, immigration, federal spending, and on and on and on. These were really intense, hard-fought battles on a lot of issues. There was a lot of disagreement in Congress generally and among Minnesota's delegates to Congress in particular. But when the roll was called in the summer of 1965 on the Voting Rights Act, every one of Minnesota's federal legislators voted yes. We were one of the proud, unanimous states. Every single member of Congress from Minnesota, the House members and the senators, the Democrats and the Republicans, the liberals and the conservatives, the greater Minnesota and the metro area, they all voted yes. Absolutely remarkable. And the best part about it was, it worked. The law actually worked. Before the Voting Rights Act, African American registration in the South was below 10%. Within 3 years, it was 62%. 62%. So Minnesota had a hand, and Minnesota had a unanimous hand in passing what has to be, by anyone's measure, one of the great pieces of legislation in the history of the United States of America. So that's what I mean when I talk about the Minnesota way and when I talk about our culture. We achieved consensus at that time, and I'd like us to get closer to the consensus that we once had. Now, here's what I'm not saying, and the legislators in the room, or former legislators, know this from their own service. I am not saying or advising that we should all be unanimous all the time on these, or frankly, that many other issues. I think vigorous debate and dissent and disagreement is a good thing in a democracy. And besides, if you know the Minnesota legislature, you know that's not very realistic. What I am saying is not that we're going to be unanimous all the time and arm in arm and singing from the same page in the hymnal. What I am saying is that on the big moral issues of who gets to participate and who doesn't, whether the door is open or closed, once upon a time, we agreed a lot more than we disagreed, and I think we're getting back to that place, and I want to help move us back to that place where I think we are already headed, and I think that's a good thing. So a few years ago, that was not the case, and we had a very divisive battle, I think, over the 2012 constitutional amendment on photo ID, and there are people of goodwill on both sides. I'm not here to evangelize on that issue. What I am saying, it was an often bitter contest, and it was an often bitter debate, and the Minnesota voters spoke on that issue, but that was a time when we did not have a consensus, obviously, and it was a close vote, and I think we were getting back to a place in recent years where we are agreeing more than we are disagreeing on these broad issues. So I think I'd like to see us get back to an agreement on election laws in general that err on the side of access and not exclusion. Just as the tie goes to the runner in baseball, the tie should go to access rather than exclusion when it comes to election law, in my view. So I mentioned that I thought there were two factors, at least according to my theory, about why Minnesota is almost always at the top of the list. Number one, I said, was culture. I believe that to be true, and I think the Voting Rights Act 50 years ago demonstrates why that continues to be true for the most part. The second reason, though, is probably simpler, and that's just laws. Laws that we've passed. Bipartisan majorities, regardless of who's in charge, Republicans and Democrats over the years, have passed laws, have created an infrastructure and a framework in our election laws that does reward participation and safeguard voting rights for the most part. For example, Minnesota was one of the first states in 1974 to impose same-day or election day voter registration, which is a tremendous thing when you think about it. It means, and those of you who have lived in other states or know people who have lived in other states know that in other states, if you don't register to vote by a pre-registration or pre-election registration deadline, you're out of luck. You cannot vote. It's usually about a month before the general election. So if you live in New York or if you live in New Jersey or most other states, that's it. Whereas in Minnesota, any one of us could roll out of bed that morning, go to the polling place, and with proper proof of residence, could register and then vote in one fell swoop. I think that's a good thing. It's had a real noticeable effect over the last 40 years, so I think that's key. We also have a motor voter law in Minnesota. Motor voter meaning that you can, when you get or renew a driver's license, check a box that will enable you to, in essence, have the information you're giving to the state double as your voter registration information. So we have that as well. We also have something that I'm particularly proud in because I authored it as a legislator, my last term in the legislature, which is no excuses absentee voting. No excuses, which means that unlike the old days, and the old days is anything before 2014, unlike the old days where you had to, if you wanted to vote absentee, if you've ever tried to or know someone who's tried to, you had to check a box on a form that said that you qualified for one of the enumerated list of sort of government-sanctioned excuses to have to vote absentee. For example, you're ill, or you are going to be out of town that day. But what was happening was there was a lot of white lying going on, and there were communities where huge percentages of the population claimed that they were, entitled to vote absentee when probably that wasn't the case. And so my philosophy all along when I was in the legislature was, why should we make lawbreakers out of everyday citizens who, by the way, are trying to do the right thing? And so we got rid of the excuse, and that means that any one of us now, anyone watching this broadcast, if they're otherwise eligible, any one of you in the audience, if you're otherwise eligible, can now vote absentee for any reason or no reason. You don't need a reason at all. You can do it just because you feel like it. You can vote from home, you can vote from your kitchen table, you can vote from your couch, whatever you want to do. And you just send that back. You can order it now online. You can order the application online, and you can sign it. You have to have a witness sign, of course. Send it back in that envelope and send it back by mail. So it's wonderful. My dad is 82 years old. He's got Parkinson's disease. He doesn't drive. He's obviously disabled, and he used it for the first time ever. He voted from home, even though he was very much in town that day. He claims that he voted for me, by the way. He says he did. Now, we have a secret ballot in this country, so I'll never really know if he did. He talks a big game, but he says he did. I'll take him at his word. The point is, it's not just for people like my dad. It's not just for people who are disabled or sick or anything like that. It could be for the busy parent carting kids around to a million activities. It could be for the worker whose work schedule is unconventional and not in normal 9 to 5 hours. It could be for someone who works in an industry that has them moving around a lot, like construction or some other industry, and that's happened here many times in Minnesota. The list goes on, but the point is you don't need that anymore, and that's a good thing. And so those are some of the examples of the fabric of laws that we have that really enable participation more than in many other places, I would say most other places in this country. So I think the culture tells us, and the law tells us why we've had such a good record, but there are barriers that remain when it comes to voting. Make no mistake about it. I know the league is very sensitive to this, so I probably don't need to tell you, but I will repeat it just for emphasis. There are barriers out there. Some are structural, by the way, but some are less structural than they are barriers of attitude or barriers of the mind. And it's those latter kind that are probably tougher to tackle. You can't really pass a bill that gets rid of a barrier of attitude when it comes to voting. But here are some of the barriers. Some people don't vote because they can't get a ride to the polls. Some people don't vote because of a foreign language barrier. I mean, they're naturalized American citizens, but English isn't their native language. And so maybe when it comes to technical instructions, they're like my late mother, who was an immigrant to this country, who spoke fluent, beautiful, almost accent-free English. But when it came to anything technical, whether it's voting or how to run the toaster, she preferred her native language to English. And so that's understandable. Some don't vote because they believe the rules are complicated or confusing. Some don't vote because they have a past felony conviction, even though it may be years since they left prison. Some don't vote because they just think it doesn't matter, and some don't vote because they're not only disillusioned, they're maybe even disgusted with the way that politics is practiced in 21st century America. So those are some of the barriers, certainly not an exhaustive list of some of the barriers out there. And for those of us who want to reduce and eliminate those barriers, who want more participation and engagement, I think the best thing is to be patient and persistent. And in that regard, there's a story I love to tell. It's really more of an anecdote that I think offers us some guidance about how we should conduct ourselves if we have that mindset, that we want to break down those barriers, eliminate those barriers, and others that I didn't mention as much as possible. And it's a story from the Voting Rights Act celebration that I told you about. It's really from the Voting Rights Act history. As my office was doing research for the Voting Rights Act and the Minnesota Connection, we found, actually the person who found it is in the second row here, Fu Lee from my office, found it in digging around old musty, dusty archives. He found a letter from a congressman in northern Minnesota in 1965, writing to one of his constituents who had written to him asking, really pleading for him to support the proposed Voting Rights Act. And he wrote back to her, and he says, yes, I support it. I support it strongly. But then he had a great turn of a phrase that I just will not leave my head. He said, I will support it. I promise you I will. It's important. He says, I will remain restless until the goal of free and fair democracy is available to everyone in this country. Restless, he said. I love that word, restless. That's how we should all behave when it comes to these democracy issues. I love the word because it connotes a certain action, a certain nervous energy, almost a twitch that enables us and really inspires us to go on, to right a wrong or to make just the unjust. I love that word, restless. So I think we should all be restless when it comes to voting and when it comes to democracy. And I hope that we can all leave here today with a restless spirit by urging others to use their voice as their vote. So let me talk to you a little bit about how I think we can do that, how we can be restless on the policy front, knowing that we won't knock down every barrier right away, but here are some ideas for your consideration and for the viewers' consideration as well, direction that I think we should go. But first, when it comes to policy, passing a bill, passing a law, and that's the first grouping that I want to talk about, actual legislative work, things you would do, trying to convince Representative Newton and his colleagues to pass something. Keep in mind, and some of you know this, some of you don't, we have a sort of rule or a practice in Minnesota when it comes to election law. Former Governor Pawlenty had this rule in place sort of implicitly and in an unspoken way, but Governor Dayton has it in place in a very explicit and clear way. And that is that elections bills, in order to be signed into law, have to have bipartisan support. Governor Dayton has said that many times. He said it as a candidate, and he said it many times as governor. So unlike almost any other issue in the legislature, it's not enough for one party who may control everything or control most things to have the votes and pass something. It has to have a critical mass of both Democratic support and Republican support. So that makes legislating in this area trickier. It's not just anymore about counting votes, because if all your votes are in one party, it's not going to get signed into law. And Governor Dayton has made that very clear, and Governor Pawlenty before him did as well, in maybe a softer way. So here are some of the things that I think could move the needle, so to speak, on breaking down some of these barriers and making sure even more in Minnesota participate and take seriously that voice that is their vote. First is moving towards early voting. Early voting. Now, we have no excuses absentee voting, which is the next best thing. For a period of 46 days before the election, you can vote absentee, and now, as you know, you can do it without an excuse. You can do it from your couch or your kitchen table. So that's pretty darn close. But early voting is something that 20 other states have. Red states have it, blue states have it, states in between have it. Our neighbors around us have it. Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. We are an island of non-early voting in a sea of early voting. And what it means is, unlike absentee voting, it means you just go into a polling place, and under game day conditions, so to speak, you put your ballot in the machine. That's it. It's peace of mind for the voter. You're not wondering whether they accepted your absentee ballot, whether it got there on time, that kind of thing, although you can track that now online, just get like you can a FedEx or UPS package, but you're not left wondering if you don't have online access. And it saves a ton of money for local governments, for those who actually are the frontline elections administrators. In fact, it's about $4 a vote that it saves, according to county governments. So that's something worth considering, and I think that'll empower a lot more people. Another one is pre-registration. Pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. 22 states have this, red states, blue states, all states in between, and it would simply mean that 16 and 17-year-olds could sign their name on a list and then be automatically registered on their 18th birthday. If, of course, everything checks out from the standpoint of security and other measures of ballot integrity. And in other states, it's been wildly successful. And it's probably tempting when you hear an idea like this to think, oh, that's just happy talk. Maybe that sounds like the kind of legislation you pass to make everyone think you're doing something about a problem, and it might not really have an effect. Not true in this case. There have been studies, deep, dense, thick, peer-reviewed studies in these other states about the effects in states where they have pre-registration. You know what the effect is? A turnout bump of between 8 and 13% among our youngest voters ages 18 to 24. 8 to 13%. So it's not just happy talk. It actually works. I'm really pleased. We just got, this is a sneak preview for you, we just got a letter from the Secretary of State of Louisiana, which is the most recent state to pass it, speaking to its sort of bipartisan credentials, so as to allay any skepticism that there might be among this political party or that. He wrote us a strong letter that we're in the process of distributing to committee chairs and other legislative leaders, talking about what a bipartisan effort and reform it was in Louisiana. It was signed into law by Governor Bobby Jindal, who's a presidential candidate. So this knows no particular ideological allegiance. It's not a liberal idea or a conservative idea. It's just an idea that works. So that's another example. I think there's one thing in Minnesota that I think we got to get off the books. Minnesota is one of 2 states in the country. Arkansas is the only other state that has a law on the books that limits the number of people that any of us as good Samaritans can help at a polling place. So if you see one person in crutches and one person in a walker and one person in a wheelchair, you've reached your limit if you want to help them around the polling place. If you see a 4th person having English language difficulties, you're not entitled to help them. It's against the law to help a 4th person. Only one other state, Arkansas, has any limit. The other 48 states have no limit on the number of people you can help in the polling place. I think that's sort of a silly law. I don't understand why it was ever passed, and I'd like to see us get that off the books as well. There are other things that we could talk about, and in the interest of time, I will self-edit here. In the Q&A, maybe we can talk about some of the others. But those are some examples of things we can move forward on policy. But what do you do about the other barriers, the barriers of attitude? Because there are plenty of people out there, particularly young people, who may say, yeah, I get it. I heard about this no excuses absentee. And yeah, I know the website to go to. I know that it's mnvotes.org. That's mnvotes.org. I know the place to go for election information. I know that I can roll out of bed in the morning if I want to and register to vote. I know all that. I choose not to vote, either consciously or unconsciously. I just don't want to vote because I'm disillusioned and maybe even disgusted, as I said, with how politics is practiced in this state and in this country. I think the answer there is outreach, and more outreach. It's a lot of individual conversations. It's some collective conversations as well. I am on the National Steering Committee now of National Voter Registration Day. We just had it on September 22nd. This is the first year Minnesota has been an official partner of that. I hope to, especially in a presidential year next year, take advantage of that day to convince people not only how easy it is in Minnesota now to register, but that it's really important that people go the next step and actually vote. We have online voter registration now. That's another bill that I authored in the legislature. So now you can, if you have an internet access, you can actually register online as well. You can actually register online. So to repeat, you can register online, you can order your absentee ballot online, which will then come to you at home, on your couch or at your kitchen table where you can vote, have someone sign as a witness, and you can send it back to the mail. Very different. Those of you who've been involved in campaigns, as I have before, you know that the usual drumbeat as the election draws near is to say, let's get our folks, whoever sides with our candidate, let's get our folks off the couch and into the ballot box and into the polling place. Well, now you don't even have to get them off the couch anymore. You don't. You just have to let them know what the rules are and let them know they can vote from the couch. So there's some people who know about that, but they choose not to vote. So I think outreach to schools is important. We have been doing that and did do that as part of our Voting Rights Act work with the League of Women Voters state chapter. But I also think it's important when we're trying to persuade people to vote to sort of pivot to the personal. I really think we have to sort of pivot to the personal. I see voter outreach or the reason for voting roughly falling into a couple categories, roughly. One category is to do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it because, for example, there were people who fought and bled and sometimes died for that right to vote, not just on foreign battlefields, but in places like Selma, Alabama on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's one way to persuade people to vote. It's just the right thing to do. That's persuasive to me. It's persuasive, I suspect, to people watching this broadcast and the people in the audience here today. But I think increasingly, and particularly with younger voters, that is less persuasive. It's not unpersuasive, it's just less persuasive. And I think the thing to do when I say pivot to the personal, that's to appeal to self-interest, not selfishness, that's different, but self-interest. To say to that young person, or any person for that matter, if you care about an issue, if you care about student loan debt, if you care about job prospects, if you care about transportation, if you care about climate change, if you care about whatever it is in your interest to vote. This isn't a eat your vegetables altruistic kind of reason for voting. This is a it's in your interest pitch for voting. And I think the more that we can sort of tilt towards the latter rather than the former, I think that's a good thing and probably going to be more effective. And the closer to the person, the better. You know, there's a Minnesota political figure who sometimes says at rallies or in speeches something that I really like a lot. He says to young people in particular, he says, you know what, you may not be into politics, but politics is into you. And I think that too is a way of appealing to self-interest, not selfishness, but self-interest in order to get people, and particularly young people, interested in voting. I remember a t-shirt I saw a while ago when I was campaigning for this job that really made an impression on me. It was in Rochester. It was at the beginning of a parade last year as I was campaigning, and someone walked by with a t-shirt. I don't know who she was. I don't know what group, if any, she was with. And the t-shirt said, "Failure to vote is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of surrender." I love that t-shirt, and I love that slogan. And particularly for younger people, I think the pitch there is to say, look, don't surrender. You turned 18 last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and you suddenly got the gift of power, real political power. Don't leave it on the table. Because if you leave it on the table, someone's going to swipe it from the table. And that someone who swipes it from the table might not agree with you, might not share your views and values. I'm not saying they're going to use your vote literally. They're not going to go vote twice. What I mean is they will, in effect, be using your vote because they're voting, they disagree with you, and you're not. So don't surrender. I know it's tempting, and I understand the impulse. I really do. I understand the impulse to not vote because to heck with all of them, right? They're not talking to me or about me. These candidates are behaving obscenely and ridiculously. They're embarrassing themselves and our democracy, they might say. I understand that impulse and the related impulse to just stay home, to say to heck with it all. I get it. But at the end of the day, I think the pitch to those voters, young or old, is to say, don't do that, because it really is surrendering. Don't surrender what you got. Don't surrender. Use that power. Tempting to do it, but don't do it. So I think all of us should heed the words of that northern Minnesota congressman. Stay restless. Let's stay restless when it comes to democracy and voting and access. So we shouldn't sit still, we shouldn't give in, and we shouldn't rest until the right to vote is real for anyone. So as you leave here tonight, I think we should remember those words, and I ask that we do two things. First, do even more for the League of Women Voters, more than you're already doing, which I know is considerable. They're a great, nonpartisan, public-spirited organization, as you know. Really one of the premier voting and democracy organizations in the state and in this country. So number one, do even more for the League of Women Voters. And number two, let a spirit of restlessness guide our politics, our words, and our actions. I urge you to contact me if you've got any ideas, insights, criticisms, debates, hostilities, anything you got. You can email me. My direct email, no filters, no gatekeepers, directly to me is just steve.simon at state.mn.us. That's steve.simon@state.mn.us. It goes right to me, not an assistant, not anyone else. Or you can call the office and call me at 651-201-1324, 651-201-1324. Our website, of course, is www.sos.state.mn.us. That's www.sos.state.mn.us. It's my honor to be with you, and it's really my honor to be your Secretary of State. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and now we're going to take questions from the audience. We've passed out cards, and we will start with... We have heard about machines being fixed to record voters a certain way. Can this happen in Minnesota?
Good question. So I won't need to repeat the question, right? Because you're mic'd.
Right.
So, right. So the question was about machines, and you did hear about that a few years ago, at least rumors to that effect. Minnesota, and I absolutely agree, we have a bipartisan commitment going back a long way to paper trails in Minnesota. We believe in paper trails. So even those places that are moving towards what I would call sort of semi-electronic or occasionally electronic recording of votes always have a paper trail backup in Minnesota. So I don't think we're susceptible, knock on wood, to that kind of mischief in Minnesota, which is good.
Good. Do you have any ideas for new legislation to make it easier for college students to vote absentee?
Well, I think really the game changer in recent years was the no excuses absentee voting. I think, because now, as I say to college students, they can vote from their dorm room, vote from home, vote from their apartment. College students are busy. Maybe they're carrying a full credit load. They have one, maybe two part-time jobs on the side. They have family responsibilities and obligations in some cases. And no excuses absentee voting ensures that they can have a hassle-free voting experience. Now, as many of you who are election watchers know, from time to time, from election to election, there is confusion sometimes about whether particular students can vote on campus. There was just such confusion last election on one campus at a public university in Minnesota about eligibility. And the eligibility for a student is no different than it is for any other voter, in the sense that you have to be a resident for a certain time, or you have to, it has to be your true residence, et cetera. But students should know that they can either, assuming they meet all those requirements, register where they live on campus, or where they're originally from. Not both, obviously, one or the other, but as long as they meet the other prerequisites, that's the key thing. So I think educating people about the current laws, particularly that law, is really, really effective. A lot of people, its maiden voyage, so to speak, was in 2014, which was a non-presidential year. And like any new law or new reform, people sometimes need a time or two or three to learn about it. So I ask everyone watching and listening here today to spread the word that this even exists, that we have something called no excuses absentee voting. For those who don't care to go to a polling place, they can vote now from home. And that includes, very prominently, college students.
Oregon has mail-in elections. Are these on the horizon in Minnesota within the next decade?
So, yes, Oregon and Washington are the two states who are completely vote by mail. They have abolished, in essence, all polling places. You can only vote by mail. There are a few narrow exceptions. Colorado is moving fast in that direction, and they are almost all the way there. So I wouldn't call it necessarily a trend. There aren't that many other states looking at it. I sort of think that Minnesota has the best of both worlds right now. Those who want to vote by mail, in essence, can, through no excuses absentee voting, which is what it amounts to. I mean, if everybody in Minnesota decided to use no excuses absentee voting, we would, I guess, be a vote by mail state in some senses. But for those who like the experience of a polling place, who want to go to a polling place, who find that more convenient and more conducive to, civic culture and all the rest, we have that too. So I don't see a great call for that yet in Minnesota, but we'll see. If we move towards, if no excuses absentee voting really takes root and really takes hold in really big numbers, I guess that's something that some people might want to consider. But I don't think in the short term that's a direction that we're particularly headed in, particularly because we sort of do have both options right now, and it's quite accessible for most people.
I think this is a statement. On the topic of getting young people to vote, I got the strongest reaction to my statement, well, your grandparents will decide your future if you do not choose to vote. Is that what you want?
Huh, interesting. Interesting. Little generational warfare there, right?
I do Eagle Scout reviews. I have been asking these young men how to get them to vote more. They said, automatic registration at age 18. Can that be done? Voting online, what will it take to do that?
Okay, let me talk about both of those things, automatic voter registration and voting online. Automatic voter registration. 2 states now, as of yesterday too, have automatic voter registration. Oregon, the governor there signed the bill into law in February or March, and then in California, I think yesterday they signed it into law. And basically that's only a gloss or a variant of what we have right now in Minnesota, and let me try to explain. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, a motor voter law. You go in, when you're either getting originally or renewing your driver's license, you can check a box that says, if you're not already registered, that says, I want this information to double as my voter registration information. But it's a so-called opt-in, meaning you have to check a box. You have to opt to do something. All that Oregon and California have done is reverse that presumption. It's now an opt-out. You can still opt out, but if you do nothing and you're not registered, that information will be used as your voter registration information, and you will be deemed registered. But you can always opt out by checking the box. So it's really not that far from what we have, but I mean, philosophically, there is a difference. I would say that I think a lot of people are going to be looking at what those states do. I support it. I support it strongly. I used to carry that bill in the legislature when I was a legislator. And I think there's bipartisan momentum behind it, but I think a lot of people are going to be watching to see what happens in Oregon and California. So yes, I do think it's possible, but as you know, as I mentioned, in Minnesota we have to have bipartisan support, so it's not enough for people of one party or the other exclusively to be for it. Let me talk about online voting, because I get that question a lot. I get asked, are we ever going to be able to, just with a click of a mouse, sit at home and actually vote? Not register to vote, we can do that online, or order the absentee ballot, we can do that online too, but to actually vote. And I would say that, I would never say never, but right now I have some really serious concerns, and they have to do with security. If Home Depot and Target and some of our most sophisticated corporate players in our national economy can't keep hackers out, then I'm not so sure that the Minnesota Office of Secretary of State can either, and the stakes are so high that I'm not so sure it's worth the risk. Now, that said, you never know what leaps in technology there will be in the next few years. Just think about this. 10 years ago, from right now, none of us had ever heard the term smartphone. It hadn't existed yet. The first Apple iPhone came out in 2007. So, I can't sit here and say it's never going to happen. Who knows if there's some great new invention in the next couple of years. But I would say that as of right now, I don't think we're ready. There are some states that have experimented in a very, very limited way with doing it. And it usually involves military personnel serving overseas, either in a combat area or something similar, like maybe they're in a submarine for a number of weeks under the Atlantic or something like that. Arizona and Alaska are 2 states that have experimented that way. And maybe there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, I have a proceed with caution kind of attitude about online voting, but you just never know. Who knows 10 years from now what technology there will be and buzzwords or terms that we've never heard of now.
There have been claims by some that Minnesota's laws invite people to vote illegally or more than once. Is there any basis for this fear?
Well, we do get that kind of contention from time to time, and it surfaced a lot in the 2012 decision that Minnesota voters made on the constitutional amendment on photo ID. Not everyone who was for it talked about this, but some did. I have to say, when it comes to voter fraud or irregularities with elections, any amount more than 0 is too much. So I never want to minimize any number or any incidence of voter fraud. That said, we have been fortunate in Minnesota that we have a very limited and I think very solvable problem when it comes to any mischief or irregularities with voting. And let me give you an example that you can even verify and look up yourself. There is a local nonpartisan think tank in Minnesota called the Center for Election Integrity, or CEI. Their website is ceimn.org, I think, so ceiminnesota.org. And they did a study, an analysis, an 87-county analysis, so all Minnesota counties, a few elections ago, where they looked to see how many irregularities rose to the level of a prosecutable kind of offense. And they found 38 in 87 counties. Now, 38 is 38 too many. I'd like to see 0. So would you. But I think a little perspective is in order. We've got a state of over 5 million people. That's a pretty good ratio. 38 over 5 million is a pretty good ratio. It's 38 too many, no question, and no amount is acceptable. But 38 is pretty darn good. And by the way, 100% of those 38, in other words, 38 out of 38, were one species of, I guess, mischief. And that is people who had a felony conviction, who were still serving their felony sentence on paper, so to speak, and who voted, thereby committing another felony. That is solvable through other means. And that's why I say it's a problem that we can tackle. So there are, there are always going to be some irregularities, but Minnesota has a very, very good record in that score. But we should always be striving to get to 0, and I will.
To follow that, should released felons who are still serving parole be allowed to vote? This will take an act of the legislature. Are there other changes that will be needed as well? Are there other obstacles that need to be eliminated?
So I know the league has taken a very strong position on saying, yes, that we should move in the direction of felon enfranchisement. Some of you may be familiar with the issue, very familiar, very thoroughly familiar. Others may not. Just a quick explanation for those who are not. So various states treat felons differently when it comes to voting. Over on this end of the spectrum, let's say, are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, in which you never lose the right to vote, ever. You could be an axe murderer serving 12 consecutive life terms, and you lose the right to vote, even in prison. But that's just Maine and Vermont. Then over a little further this way on the continuum, let's say, are a number of states, North Dakota among them, and obviously our neighbors, so the one we know the best, and a growing number of states in this category that say, look, we're going to have a bright line rule. If you're in prison, you can't vote. When you step out of prison, you can, even if you're serving part of your sentence on supervised release or probation, or in some cases parole, then that's the rule. And then there's the grouping next, further on the continuum, that includes Minnesota, which in Minnesota the rule is you can only get your right to vote back after your whole sentence is done, both the prison part and the non-prison, or so-called on-paper part. And then way over here on this end of the spectrum are a number of states, mostly in the Deep South, where either actually or practically you really never get your right to vote back if you're a felony for many felonies. And so the challenge is, what do we do? I do think that we ought to move towards the North Dakota model for at least a couple of reasons. One is just ease of administration. There's a lot of confusion out there in Minnesota and other states that have this same rule. There's a lot of confusion out there about what the rules are. And some of you may have talked to, as I have, candidates who have the heartbreaking situation of encountering a voter, if they're door knocking or involved in a campaign or whatever, who says, oh, thanks for coming to my door, but I can't vote. And then you ask them, what do you mean you can't vote? Well, I had a felony 20 years ago. Well, are you still serving on paper? Oh, no, I've been off paper for 14 years. Sir or ma'am, you can vote. And they didn't think they could, and they've stayed away from the polls all these years. So there's a lot of confusion, but a bright line rule has, at the very least, ease of administration as an advantage. I mean, unless there's an escapee who comes to the polls, anyone who's there and otherwise eligible, that's someone who can vote. Another reason is fairness. And I've given this some thought, and I've traveled some distance on this issue myself, and you get folks who are coming out of prison, trying to put their lives back together, who are trying to be a role model for their families, who want to be invested or reinvested in the community. They're, by the way, living amongst us. They're paying taxes, trying to get work or working, riding the bus on the highway, etc. And it seems like they ought to be given that chance to be reinvested in society as long as they, obey the rules. And that's where a lot of people are going. That's where the consensus seems to be heading in Minnesota. I have to say, those who have organized the efforts have made great strides in the last number of years. The bill that was before the legislature this year had very deep and very wide support. You had multiple liberal Democrats on the bill and multiple conservative Republicans on the bill. So it was support that was very deep and very wide, and I think we're probably going to end up moving in that direction, as other states have.
A state senator informed me that ranked choice voting confuses naturalized citizens and specific ethnic and racial groups. Do you agree?
I have not seen evidence of that. Ranked choice voting, some people love it, some people hate it, but I haven't been persuaded that a reason not to be for it is that it's somehow confusing. The experience in Minneapolis, a very diverse city, ethnically and otherwise, demonstrates that people could handle it and knew how to do it. My position on ranked choice voting is that I think cities should have the choice about whether to enact it or not. Right now, under current law, only certain kinds of cities, the so-called charter cities, which tend to be the bigger cities, not always, but they tend to be, like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, etc., they can do it on their own. If their voters vote to do it, or if their city councils say they ought to do it, they can experiment with ranked choice voting only for municipal elections, obviously not for governor or president, but just for municipal elections. But the rest of the cities, who are not so-called charter cities, they have to go on bended knee to the legislature and beg for a separate bill and separate legislation. And it just always sort of struck me as not right. I mean, if a particular city, whether it's Roseville or Red Wing or Thief River Falls or whatever, if they want to experiment with it, I think they ought to. If they hate it, they should ditch it. If their voters like it, they should keep it. But so I've supported the legislation that just gives them a free hand, gives municipalities, cities, a free hand in choosing it. I think it's an interesting experiment. And, you know, I'd like to see cities other than the really big cities. Right now it's Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth is about to vote on whether to do it in its fall elections. I'd like to see a smaller city or a suburb try it. So it's not just an urban environment, and see how that goes. Maybe it'll be a disaster, maybe it'll be a success, I don't know, but I'd like to see that.
Does the Secretary of State have a role in ensuring that the legislature follows their own rules in lawmaking? This year, Senate bills were not available for review until hearing time, and new provisions were added to a bill in conference committee that were not in the bill of either house. This limited opportunity for public reviews and participation in writing of these laws.
Well, the short answer is no. We have no role in that, and the legislature is really left to police itself. There are times when the legislature can be sued, not by us, but people can sue the legislature, and it's happened once or twice in recent history where the legislature, where the allegation is that the legislature failed to follow its own rules. It's really hard to do, and basically you have to count on those who govern the House and the Senate to do the right thing and follow the rules.
Early voting seems to favor only people who vote straight party ticket. Some thoughtful voters want to wait for information about individual candidates, which comes later. Please comment.
I disagree with that. I think I understand what the questioner is asking about. You know, the early voting period in the bill that we're supporting would be only a couple weeks. And it is true that, that when you vote early, you are, because when you vote early, you put in that machine, you can't fish it out again. So if you vote on day minus 13, let's say, towards the beginning of early voting, and then a scandal breaks, or there's a gaffe, or the candidate you supported does something terrible, or the candidate that you didn't support does something wonderful, that's it. So that is a risk, it's true. I wouldn't say that it rewards straight party ticket voters. It probably rewards people who are decided one way or another, and some people, Minnesota is a ticket splitting kind of state, usually throughout its last decades. And so just because someone is firmly decided, they may have decided to vote for 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats and 1 independent, but they're decided. It is true. That is true. But I think voters realize, or should, that when they do vote early, that is a risk. Now, with absentee voting, by the way, until the Tuesday before, until 1 week before, you can call it back. You can fish it out of there. And that happened, if you recall, in some places after the Paul Wellstone death, for example, people who wanted to take back their absentee ballots for whatever reason. So I do think early voting is a good thing. I haven't seen evidence of that in other states. I think it just rewards people who want to get voting out of the way, want the peace of mind of actually putting it in rather than mailing it in or dropping it off. So I haven't seen evidence that that's the case.
What are your thoughts about allowing residents who are non-citizens to vote in school board and local elections? I believe it would be a good idea and an extension of our democracy.
Yeah, I don't know about that one yet. I'd have to give that a lot more thought. There are a lot of potential unintended consequences there, and I'd really have to think about some of the ripple effects. my mother was an immigrant to this country, and so I'm grateful to all immigrants. So it's not that, but I'd have to give that a lot more thought.
As a former legislator and current constitutional officer, are you willing to publicly advocate for the ex-felon eligibility to vote?
I have, yes.
All right. As the Secretary of State, what is your favorite part of the job?
This sounds like pandering, but I love groups like this, and I love talks like this, and just being able to have a good Q&A and a discussion. I think that's great. I really also love traveling the state. I concluded very early on that you cannot do this job well by just sitting in an office in St. Paul. We have too many partnerships and too many relationships across areas, not only with elections officials, because it's a two-way street. We help run and administer the election system with the active participation of the counties and in some cases cities and towns as well. So in elections, in business services, and at the Safe at Home program and other duties as well, we have partnerships all over. So I have made it a priority to get out and about. I've now been to 66 out of our 87 counties in the first 9 months. By the end of next week, it'll be 76, and I should, with any luck, be able to wrap up all 87 by the end of my first year. So that is great. It's always an education. It's always a horizon broadener. It's always a way to just learn new things and deepen already existing partnerships. So I've really appreciated getting around the state.
Are voter lists used for a call to serve on jury duty? I have heard some don't vote because they don't want to serve on a jury because their employer doesn't pay and jury pay is too little.
Yeah, but I will just editorialize that jury pay is really a problem that we're going to have to tackle. Sometimes you have people in trials for weeks and they get paid next to nothing. But yes, they are used. I would not advise someone not voting just because they don't want to be in a jury. There are other ways and methods to get out of jury duty other than that. Some are genuine hardships, some are others, but I wouldn't stay away from the polls for that reason.
My son is in the Foreign Service. During the last election, he was posted in the U.S. Embassy in Kazakhstan and was unable to obtain an absentee ballot or access to one, even though he went onto the website. No information was available, and he was not able to register online.
That is terrible. I hope he didn't live in Minnesota because that should not be. We have online voter registration right now. We also have stuff on our website that talks about the procedures. There are special procedures in place. There's an acronym, UOCAVA voters. It's Uniformed Overseas, anyway, UOCAVA. And there are UOCAVA procedures for people who qualify, and it includes all members of the military. It includes, students, diplomats, missionaries, business people who are overseas. So certainly the person who was talked about in this question would qualify. And those special procedures, those special shortcuts include things like having your ballot sent to you by email. You can't return it by email. You still have to return it in conventional ways. But unlike the rest of us, if you qualify under UOCAVA, if you're an overseas voter from Minnesota, you can cut down on half, or in some cases more than half, of the postage time by having your ballot actually emailed to you. So I'm really sorry that person encountered that kind of challenge and difficulty. I hope on my watch that won't be the case. I have yet to administer an election. Obviously, I was elected last election, so 2016 will be my first real test, so I hope you'll put me to the test, and I hope that won't happen.
Please tell us about your thoughts about the National Popular Vote Bill. Any possibility of enough bipartisan support?
Yes, I think there is a possibility of bipartisan support. I carried that one too in the legislature. National Popular Vote is something I'm really intrigued by. It would basically say that states would award their electoral votes on the basis of who won the national popular vote. Now keep in mind, we have this thing called the Electoral College, right? The founders said states can allocate them any way they want. Minnesota has 10, for example. So you can allocate them any way you want. The framers never said it had to be, they never even mentioned or conceived of the fact that it had to be a winner-take-all. It just happens that 48 out of the 50 states have gravitated towards a winner-take-all, where if you win the state by one vote, all your electoral votes go to that person. But that's a choice. That's not in the Constitution. It's not what the framers necessarily intended. They were silent as to the method. So, for example, Minnesota, if we wanted to, as absurd as it is, if we wanted to award our electoral votes to the tallest candidate or the candidate with the most letters in his or her name, we could do that. It would be silly, it would be absurd, but we have the choice about how to award them. So all this would say is that we have the choice, and we are taking that choice and voluntarily saying that we will award our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And the reason for it, I think, is pretty simple. I really do believe that when you're electing the most powerful person in the world, let alone other offices, but certainly the most powerful person in the world, the person who gets the most votes should win. And lest you think that this is about avenging Bush versus Gore in 2000, where Al Gore got 500-some thousand more votes than ultimate President George W. Bush, I can assure you that I held this view long before that election. And I just think it's the right thing to do. It's very difficult, I think, for the United States to go around the world and talk to, say, an 11-year-old girl in Afghanistan or a 9-year-old boy in Iraq and say, we want to bring you democracy. But by the way, there are some circumstances where the second place vote getter actually wins. Very tough to reconcile, especially when the framers, the founders of the Constitution, said the states get to choose. So this doesn't require an amendment to the Constitution. It just requires the legislature to act. There are several states now, including very big states, that have enacted it. It doesn't take effect, though, until states adding up to 270 electoral votes, which is the magic number to elect a president, also agree to join. So they haven't reached the 270 mark yet, but some very big states have already agreed to join. So I do support it. I understand why some people, aren't there yet or have some misgivings, but it's something that I've supported.
Our final question is, can you campaign actively on voting issues while you are in office?
And I campaign actively on voting issues. On voting issues, yes. I mean, I'm not sure what the questioner means, campaign on. I mean, I have views, I have opinions on voting issues, on elections issues, if that's what the questioner means. And yes, I've testified several times before the legislature. We have a legislative agenda. Some are things that come from our office. Some are other people's projects or ideas that we lend our voice and our weight and our support to. But yeah, I think that's a natural, necessary, and healthy thing. My predecessors have all done that. Take positions on actual elections-related issues and issues on democracy. And I'm going to continue to do that. I think that's good.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. We really
Thank you.
appreciate your time and especially the message.
And can I just say one last thing?
Yes.
I just want to reiterate, too, I really urge viewers out there in the viewing audience and those who are here in person to take me up on my invitation to you to reach out to me. Not necessarily today or tomorrow, but next week or next month or next year. If you have ideas or you have issues or you have criticisms, let me know about that. My email, as I said before, my direct email, no filters, no gatekeepers, is steve.simon@state.mn.us. And the phone number is 651-201-1324. Remember, the website is sos.state.mn.us. And the real shortcut website to elections information is mnvotes.org, mnvotes.org. So thanks for your time and attention. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.